everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Bielecki, talk to writers about writing, and very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. Today, I talked to Mike Corrao about his new sandpaper-covered book, Stealth Anxiety Megamix. Mike Corrao is the author of numerous works, including Gut Text from 1111 Press, Rituals Performed in the Absence of Ganymede, also 1111 Press, Desert Tiles from Equus Press, and Smut Maker from Inside the Castle, as well as many more. His work often explores the haptic, architectural, and organismal qualities of the text object. As an artist and designer, his work has been featured in the catalogs of 1111 Press, Phonograph Editions, Apocalypse Party, Inside the Castle, and other presses. As an editor, he operates Cloak.wtf. Before we get into my conversation with Mike, let's talk about how you can support the show. The ways using money are patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. For $2 a month, you can get these episodes a little bit early. You can also throw a one-time donation over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's on Amazon. It's pretty darn good. I also encourage you to post about these episodes on social media if you like them, share them with your friends. You can also rate Writing the Rapids an appropriate number of stars if wherever you listen has that option. I encourage you to do that. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Mike. I think it would be easy to start out with, let's talk about why sandpaper, but I just don't want to yet. I don't want to get there yet. We'll talk about the contents of the book before we talk about the cover.
Okay.
I think the part that really engaged me the most was the sort of star map bit in the front half of the book. I was surprised to see that the book was on Goodreads for some reason. But it is. So, rate it and review it on Goodreads if that's a social media platform you use, dear listener. But I had only up until that point just kind of picked it up as whenever I passed it in our library to flip through it. But I read one of the first reviews that said that this was this is Mike's most personal book to date, is what the person said. And then I got to that star map sort of area, and I was like, oh, is he just mapping out his brain? And that's how I read it. That's how I decided to read it. And I'm curious if that's at all close to what the intent was.
It kind of is. I had originally thought of doing the whole book as that, just 100 of these kind of maps. And I wanted the kind of setting of them. I like the wording of star map. I had kind of envisioned them as being within a void, which I think is very similar. Sure. But just this speckled darkness that these ideas are occupying. I had kind of put it together as, in the way that I write, I typically will collect a lot of these terms and phrases that stick out to me. Things that pop up in there, flooded cellar or black hyperbox or gestalt land. These just weird little snippets. And I had wanted to do this kind of zeitgeist mapping originally, but it inevitably becomes just your own kind of point of view within that zeitgeist. And being the kind of weird man that I am, that particular perspective is all of these esoteric terms that I was fixated on. So I liked the idea of trying to map them out relationally. How do these connect? Where are they within proximity to each other? But then within the larger scope of the book as it grew, kind of using them as a way to spatialize this kind of climate catastrophe eco-poetic zone that the book kind of becomes later on. And so I like the idea that as you read the more direct and kind of forward-moving sections of the book, you can go back and be oh, does this take place in Contusion Zone or Theater of Operations? You can try to kind of map out in your head where these bizarre scenes are kind of playing out. I am very interested. I didn't see that comment about it being the most personal. I don't necessarily think that's wrong, but I am really interested in that kind of observation.
It was a useful observation for me because I think that, and I feel like I've expressed maybe this anxiety a little bit in a couple of the recent episodes with the more avant-garde of us, that I'm questioning how I read this type of expanded field area, because I I think to make it palatable at first, I had to like really sort of detach myself from any sort of like meaningful analysis, because like I was very unused to the form, so any sort of like references that are happening, I wasn't getting, and I mean I'm still not getting. Like I understand who Deleuze and Bataille are now, but really that's about as far as I've gotten. I know who Adorno is, right? I have a reading list of continental Francophile philosophers that I need to bang my head against. So I was just sort of like, I'm gonna just like let the words flow over me. I'm just gonna kind of like stick to whatever I stick to and not worry too much about like, is there a narrative? Is there not a narrative? Why? Sort of thing. But and your work can be mechanical, and I think kind of on purpose. Like we talked about Spelunker on here before, and just other stuff there, that it just kind of feels like if there is flesh to it, it's cyborgy.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that comes from, I'm very interested in like data or the accumulation of information. Those maps very much kind of embody that, in that it's kind of all of this text that I've accumulated from outside sources and mutated in whatever minor ways, and then kind of found ways to kind of organize it in maybe an architectural sense. Recently, I've been really invested in this idea of the kind of text as a navigable thing, rather than thinking of, narrative or poetry or kind of these like very traditional modes of kind of moving through a book. I've been interested in trying to kind of form some type of structure with the text where, you can read these short phrases and they become almost kind of textural or material, in the same way that you could view like a particular type of like wall, whether it's like perforated brick or like staccato, or these kind of different modes of the environment around you, and trying to kind of create something that you move through rather than kind of directly kind of listen to or take on as narrative. I want you to kind of have your own methodology for going through the text. On the title page, I put non-intentional, non-hierarchical, as kind of this motivating phrase, maybe just for myself, but that there's no intention on my end for how you engage with the book, outside of the fact that you kind of inhabit it in whatever way you find appealing or useful, or kind of whatever way you can get something out of it. And then non-hierarchical meaning, that I have no power over you. I'm not above you as the author. It's the reader kind of brings as much to the book as I do. You're the one kind of connecting and kind of forming the constellations in that star map. I've just kind of given you the points to work between. And I think that kind of connecting it back to that first question, it becomes personal because it's kind of these terms that or this data that I've accumulated. It's very much kind of from my point of view and the things that I've been fixated on. And I think that kind of comes through without a particular intention as well. Although there is some very kind of apparent climate anxiety and kind of anti-capitalist imagery sprinkled throughout there, that is very much intentional.
Yeah, we love to see it. I feel like the discussion pops up every now and again about like why right wingers love the avant-garde so much, or at least, yeah, I suppose the avant-garde. I was gonna say maybe like the profane or the taboo, but I guess they're linked. The avant-garde and the profane are linked. But anyway, yes. So I'm glad that you put some things in there just to make certain people bounce off or change their minds. Maybe you planted a seed.
It would be wild if this is the thing that like turned someone, you know,
Right.
if they read this book and they're like, I'm leaning to the left now.
A couple years ago, it was ContraPoints. Now it's you. You're just de-radicalizing 19-year-olds
It's
left and
the
right.
sandpaper book does it every time.
Yeah, man.
They feel that cover and they're a new person.
Just sloughing off all of the reactionary tendencies. Just whoosh.
Exactly.
So heck, let's get into it. Let's get into the sandpaper. Why sandpaper?
Well, so it's kind of not a long story, but a long timeline, or longer than I'm used to. About probably 5 years ago now, I had met Andrew Wilt from 1111 for the first time because he was moderating the release for my first book, Man Oh Man. And we had kind of met beforehand just to get to know each other before the event. And he was just starting 1111, and we had gone on some tangent about there's this Guy Debord book from probably the 60s, I'm not exactly sure, called Memories that he had bound in sandpaper. And I think he had only done like one or two kind of exhibition copies. And we both got really kind of invested in this idea of like the abrasive book, because we had been talking about gut text at that time before it was coming out, but after we had kind of agreed to start working on it together, and about these ideas of like being against the reader, having some type of kind of antagonism towards your reader, and that idea of the very kind of physical antagonism of being uncomfortable to hold came up, or maybe an even more outward antagonism of it rooting the books on either side of it. And we had talked about it for years, and it would come up all the time about maybe we'd do this as an anthology for 1111, like collected voices in the expanded field, or maybe we'll do it for this person's book. But it's quite a task to even consider telling somebody that their book should be bound in sandpaper. To kind of bring that idea forth to a third party is so kind of contextually demanding. It has to be like the perfect book for it. And so we had kind of sat on this for 4 or 5 years until I wrote Stealth Anxiety Megamix, and I was like, this feels like the right book, with that kind of climate anxiety and that like kind of violent poetic nature of the text. It like felt like the time to kind of make that destructive object and play into that kind of that climate element or that eco-poetic element, thinking like in an almost irrational way of like, I want to hurt the people like you know, that cause these things, but although realistically I don't know if Bezos is going to pick up a copy. But even this kind of like almost childish, like I'll get rid of objects, like the less objects the better, and kind of in that using it as almost like a weapon or a defensive tool, and trying to almost give it a usefulness beyond just being text. Because I think often text can be political and have value and have an active role, but I think often those kind of textual forms of kind of political messaging fall short, or they're not, you know, writing a book about how climate catastrophe bad doesn't really fix anything about climate catastrophe. And so I like this almost like needless kind of reaching out, like, see, I'm trying to do something, even if it's fruitless or frivolous or ineffective.
I like that. There was an element to the text of the book that I felt was angry and almost belligerent. Like, I hesitate to say belligerent, but I can't think of a better term, so I'll say it. But there is an element to kind of the way that the words are placed and the sort of like the mashing together of like nouns that you do. That is like a thing that I do a lot if I'm like angry writing poetry. Like if I'm writing something that like no one's ever gonna see and I'm just kind of like pent up for whatever reason. It's like a similar sort of outcome linguistically for me, where the words are just kind of like clashing against each other and clanging. So it's cool to know that like that is part of it, that like it extends outward.
Yeah, and I think that there's this certain tendency, or maybe not even tendency, but this kind of general view of poetry as something that's either soft or contemplative or reflective. And I'm more compelled by, and I think this kind of method often lands in like that stereotype of like spoken word, but this kind of like feverish, like angry, compulsive kind of poetics I find really interesting. Like it's built out of frustration. I want to see more violence in poetry to an extent, because I think that's something that's not often, I mean, often discussed within any given poem, but not often attempted as kind of the mode of being. And I find it really cathartic, or even kind of amps you up when the line of the poem is like the burning down an oil rig or a house, or like splaying a capitalist vampire on the solar panel to cook. Like there's a certain kind of like cathartic violence in that, being kind of the party without power. You know, the rich and these large corporations are the ones that contribute almost like exclusively to climate change. I think it's something like 75 or 80% is corporate and not individual.
I'm kind of surprised it's that low.
I know, and it could be higher. I don't really have a source in front of me, to be honest, but like being the person who can't, like I can't stop driving a car and stop eating meat and fix the problem on my own, and so to be like like I hope you burn first is kind of a cathartic statement in that setting.
Yeah. I really love that desire to sort of have that sort of like crust punk bombast in poetry. And you know, I've made no secret of the fact that like my favorite poets are old men from the Midwest writing about like tumbleweeds and shit. So like I can't be like, well, it's not out there. I don't know why it's not out there. But I can think of like Stephen Jesse Bernstein, who has a lot of stuff like that. I listen to his recording of his poem Face like 3 times a month. And yeah, like I think I the first time I ever really considered poetry as a medium that could be for me in some way was coming home sick from school in high school and like checking out whatever was on HBO, because like my parents got it for a month and whatever Comcast package they had, and it was some slam poetry spoken word like competition for other high schoolers, where people were talking about like, you know, seeing cops murder their friends, or you know, fuck you Marilyn Monroe for ruining beauty standards for women and stuff like that. And just like none of the content really like affected me at the time, but just the fact that like it's not all butterflies and flowers and dreams and clouds and stuff.
Yeah, that frustration is compelling, and I think that really drove the connection that it has with the kind of Sandpaper Bookjack, as it kind of embodies that outward aggression. And I think a lot of that kind of anger can be kind of bad, or not bad in its intention, but like be bad art in those kind of spoken word scenes. And I think you have to have a certain amount of silliness or kind of playfulness in that anger. Like the absurdity of saying like, I'm going to burn an oil rig, you know, is such a strange and like unreasonable sentiment, although well-intentioned, that I think that you have to kind of like fully lean into that anger and that violence of the kind of method to properly use it. And I like the sandpaper as kind of the gateway into that. It's like you're uncomfortable the whole time you're holding the book. I had a friend who said that they wrapped the cover spread in a washcloth while they read it so they didn't have to touch it, because it just felt so gross on their hands. Or one of my favorite bits that I had heard, because people have kind of been telling me about their experiences with the book, is Logan Berry, who you've had on before, had like his window broken a few weeks ago, and during the cleanup, one of the people had put the sandpaper book in the garbage pile, assuming that it had been shredded by the glass. rather than like recognizing how it was bound. And there's something about the idea that like from a distance it appears to be trash that I find so beautiful, that I love about it. It's not even like, it doesn't even look good enough to be a book. It just belongs in the garbage immediately.
I will say that my copy, the part that bugs me the most is not the sandpaperness, but the fact that it's like kind of bound unevenly. Like it's just off center, so I can't like open the book all of the way. Like I can't lay it flat, and yeah, like there's an asymmetricalness to it that really bugs me, because it was easy enough for me to just kind of figure out how to like hold it with as little friction as possible. Use one hand as a sort of stand, and then just use the other hand to turn the pages, and then you're barely moving your fingers. And yeah, like it's funny that you have to like figure out how to accommodate the book. And I will also say that I'm pleased at the amount of self-awareness that you have about it. Not that I expected anything less, but like, as my wife had to wrestle the book away from our daughter a couple of times, I think she was getting frustrated with it, and she's just like, some of the stuff you read, I just don't get it. Like, I don't understand why it's like this. And, you know, for me, like, at first, like, that is the case, too. Like, oh, there's a Discord beep. Hooray, someone's talking. There's, I'm not smart enough, and we said this early, to, like, get it on the first, second, or third pass. And so the whole reason why this show exists, not the whole reason, one of the big reasons is so that I have access to people, and I can be like, but why though? And I'm pleased that there is like a good but why though, or one that at least like satisfies me emotionally. Like, it makes sense. There's a rationale to it.
Yeah, and kind of to address your note about that first pass, I've been kind of in this work specifically trying to avoid this kind of like referential dependency. And in part, I try to kind of open that gate right away. I think the first page ends with the phrase "I have nothing to hide," which is then reiterated on the next spread. In that, you know, a lot of these lines and a lot of these pieces in general have a lot of references to various things. But I like the idea of approaching it without any concern for that, like you've done on your first pass. The kind of phrase that comes out of not knowing that term is often better than what the phrase actually means. I think the kind of classic example of that is the Deleuze classic term of body without organs, which is this overly complicated, you know, geopolitical psychoanalytic term, but is so much better without knowing what it means. It's like a body without organs taken like literally is such a interesting image that I don't really want people to think about the source of it. It's more like, I'm glad I read that so I could have that weird phrase to now pull into the vocabulary. I'm not necessarily concerned with what these phrases always mean, but more just the image that's invoked by kind of whatever combination of words they've decided to use to kind of label it.
Yeah. I like the sort of like butterfly affecting ness of the the referendum, referentiality, of just being like, oh, that sounds badass. It feels like a very like metal band thing to do. Like,
yeah.
You know, the joke of like, a metal band will just open up a medical textbook and find like the craziest name for a disease possible, and then just kind of go from there.
There's this old meme of like, I can't remember what author it was, but he says something along the lines of like, I've written more books than I've read, and I find that so inspirational.
That's from,
to be
that's
like,
from
there is no source.
Garth Marenghi's Dark Place.
Yes, that's it. And I love that idea so much of like, there is no outside source. There is only whatever combination of phrases I've put together. and what you've interpreted from it. There's no like greater meaning to pull. There's no intention.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Like, I think with regard to like my reaction to things, I feel like generally I'm, especially like when it's people I know writing books, I've kind of primed myself to be uncritical. But I think of like other times. I remember watching a Death Grips interview, and they were just like, I don't know, in some squat somewhere. Like why they chose that location was probably just to like maintain a sort of aesthetic. And they were asking MC Ride like, where's your inspiration coming from? And he's just like, only from inside. I've been turning away from everything that isn't me and like only pulling lyrics out of myself. And at the time I remember just being like, oh, really? Like, come on. You mean to tell me you only listen to Death Grips?
What a absurd image too. It's just him sitting alone and listening to like Guillotine or something. I like that. I think that my kind of variation of it is that I will take in all of these things, but without the intention of like properly connecting them to the work, and rather just kind of taking them for their surface value rather than the deeper meaning that they're trying to evoke. Like going back to Deleuze, it's the famous Thousand Plateaus, and capitalism, schizophrenia is such a like dense theoretical text, and I'm not really concerned with what they're trying to convey there. When I'm using that within a book or poetic work or whatever, I'm rather thinking similar to like the metal band with the medical textbook. I'm like, nomad machine's a wild term, and I am curious like what I can do with that. Because most people, will see nomad machine and they're like a machine that moves around, or like trying to kind of approach it at face value, like with that combination of words. And I find that much more useful than kind of having some anchor point that I can be like, oh, well, I'll say nomad machine and then they'll know what I mean. I'd rather they don't know what I mean and have to kind of interpret what that combination or that mashing of words.
Yeah, there's something kind of rewarding to it too. One of the reasons why in high school I was so into the very verbose hip hop stylings of like Bus Driver and Aesop Rock, and then to a similar extent like all of nerdcore hip hop, was just that I could like sit down and Google lyrics and like learn a bunch of stuff. Like I feel like my first, like I think I had maybe seen the Fritz the Cat movie around the same time, but like Googling R. Crumb because Aesop Rock name dropped him in a song is like such a rewarding experience. And going back to guests of this show, like I Googled egg bog blushy and it's a real thing. Like you kind of never know with Mike. You just like, is he being a goof? Is he doing his thing? And it was a reference, and it like changed the entire sort of reading of the little pamphlet.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the best function of the reference is to work both ways, to both function as its own surface level thing, but then add something to the text as you kind of sift through it. And I like that within that kind of architectural navigable mode for the book, because then it kind of gives you these monuments or anchor points or these kind of points of interest on the map to kind of stop at and kind of dwell for a while. I think there's a lot of ways to use that, and within that environmental setting, I think it allows for a certain amount of kind of duration, or to kind of expand the time you spend on those otherwise pretty sparse spreads in terms of the typical amount of text on a page. I think it could function as a really interesting kind of way to play at how the reader approaches the work and where they pause and kind of sit for a moment.
Yeah. And I know that you've worked with Garrett Strickland a lot. I think about his work with regard to this conversation too, that like a lot of his stuff really kind of hinges on pulling yourself through portals in the book and stuff like that. And I use the word portal deliberately.
I know.
I'm interested in, speaking of references, the sort of like 3D wireframe sort of looking images. I think I saw Treffry tweet about like introducing writers to this architecture program. Are those two things related? My mind is fuzzy on that tweet. Yeah,
they're very much related. They're all made using Rhino, which is the program that John is referring to. A while back, I had been trying to make, I think it might have actually been for this book, the 3D kind of fabric like elements within the book. I had been trying to figure out a way to make them, and John had suggested Rhino. And teaching at Kansas, he had made tutorial videos for his intro classes and sent them to me, and so I kind of quickly learned the program in order to make those parts of this book. And it's very useful I often use it just for capturing the viewport from the actual kind of working model rather than exporting it as like a nice kind of rendered 3D piece.
Sure.
And so in those fabric pieces, you're seeing kind of a half-made model, and in those wireframes, you're very literally seeing kind of the frame, the skeleton of the piece, which I've kind of isolated from that grid background. I like the kind of, it's both structural and abstract in a way that I find really appealing. I don't have to make a building for you to occupy. I can kind of make this vague set of kind of posts and hallways and kind of monumental spaces for you to occupy without necessarily being like, I'm in a courtyard, I'm in this kind of space. You can kind of occupy it more abstractly. And I think I played with that a bit with one of the spreads that says drink the nectar of the water slide, and has one of these kind of wide furling wireframes. They take on this kind of abstract quality that I find really, really appealing, and that is compelling to see how people kind of engage with, because it's not necessarily photographic that you just kind of look at it and move on, but there's a way that being kind of interlaced set of lines you kind of move through naturally, being that, you know, the type around it is made of a similar kind of material, being also made of kind of these thin winding lines.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of going to the planetarium as a kid, and they had these sort of like vector graphics to make you feel like you're floating through a tunnel and stuff, and it's interesting to kind of see something like that folded in on itself and then like outside of it, like outside of three-dimensional space, something like that.
Yeah, and playing in that poor image is really kind of a fruitful space, being that there's a certain amount that you don't have to fully do yourself. You can meet the reader halfway and say, like, I've begun building this space for you, and I'm now curious to see how you occupy kind of the half-formed thing.